Today we have Avery Bang. She is the CEO of Bridges to Prosperity. They have helped over 1 million people to get access to hospital facilities, school facilities, working environments throughout the world. So by providing these pedestrian bridges. She also has her Bachelor of Science degree in Civil Engineering from the University of Iowa. And she also has a Bachelor of Arts degree in Studio Art from the University of Iowa, a master's degree from CU Boulder in Geotechnical Engineering, and a MBA from Oxford, I believe, right?
I like school a lot, apparently. Who knew?
And also a very distinguished speaker with over 100 speaking engagements in the books for audience up to 5,000 people, including, I believe, an event for the UN and then a couple of TED Talks too. So I would like to welcome Miss Avery Bang. And I guess maybe one question I have for you to get started with is maybe what sparks these passions for you? So you have a lot of things on your resume, a lot of things that you do that you're very passionate about. So maybe if you could focus on one of those sparks that occurred or something that really fueled that passion for you.
That's a good question. I think a lot of our true essence is really there as a kid. And then we spend our teenage years and sometimes our 20s moving away from, and then you can kind of come back into that core, like who are you at the very, middle of your core center. And as a kid, I had a chance to play clarinet. It was awful. So there's both bad at and uninteresting. Similarly with, softball, I just couldn't quite figure out how to throw it far enough. But there were these things that I think there's this kind of self-propelling convenience that you're okay enough at them that they give you pleasure. And I think what I ended up noticing about the things that gave me pleasure and fun was I was a lot more motivated by the things that were together in a group, in a team. I was a pretty terrible swimmer. So I didn't like to be alone in that lane. And I certainly didn't want to go swim by myself in that lane. But when I could go to soccer practice and I could see the interweavings of how this web of individuals on this field came together to do something, kind of bigger than yourself, I loved it. I could just see that fire in my belly. And I'm 7 years old, kicking around with really no vision of the field. But that was getting excited about people for me ended up fueling a lot of the things I ended up, here in my mid 30s, really being, most of what I do, which I really enjoy, is usually with people. And most of which I kind of get not bored by, because it's a little simple, but things that I don't find the time or the willpower to continue doing are usually things that are solitary and don't seem to have an impact on others. So. Do you want me to give you an example, or is that enough of a
well, I think
generality?
That brought up something. So I think it's really neat how you consider yourself a connection person. And I think it's so cool how with Bridges to Prosperity, it ties in an actual physical connection between these people that need to get across a river to get to essential services, and then the people connection. So just connecting with people. I love the literal and figurative sides of that. And I think it just totally ties together. So that's really neat. But yeah, if you want to give an actual example of that too, if you can think of one, if not, that's fine too.
Yeah. I think a really poignant example was I was living in Fiji at the end of college and, coming back over to return to, hopefully all goes as well, finish my engineering degree at the University of Iowa. And they have these year-end projects, kind of your culminating senior project. And you're going through the queue and kind of looking at what projects you essentially want to get excited about. And, I think there's a misconception that engineers really are solitary people, all of them, and they only want to sit down and be really good with a spreadsheet. To be clear, I can make a mean spreadsheet, but I wanted something that was more. And so I'm going down the queue of these projects, and I don't think my experience was unique in that as I looked across the options, I was pretty uninspired. And I was like, well, okay, this is going to be just another class project. And I think you brought this up earlier, is like the enterprising part of me essentially came back to the center and said, well, hey, professor, what would you think about if I proposed my own project? And what if we were to imagine building a bridge in some place like Peru, something really wild? And, you first get these reactions, especially from adults. And at that time, I kind of consider myself a young adult. And there's first deep skepticism. And then there's like, okay, why? And then there ends up like you can kind of convert that questioning into something of like a shared enthusiasm. But it was this project where I imagined myself sitting alone in a dark computer lab for dozens and dozens and dozens of hours to come up with this senior project. And I was going to learn something from it. I was going to be a better engineer. There was going to be an outcome, I'm sure, sometime in life I was going to appreciate. But the moment that they said yes, and they're like, go get 4 or 5 of your best friends. Yes, let's design a bridge, and totally go take your summer and go learn how to actually build the bridge in a place that you hardly know where it's at. And frankly, your linguistic skills are poor. And the outcome of that was like, I was so excited. I got to work with my people. I got to learn something. I certainly spent a heck of a lot more time than I would have if I had been in this uninspiring computer lab. And meanwhile, I still was able to learn, I think, a lot of the same project management skills, a lot of the same communication skills, a lot of the same computer modeling and procurement ideas that I believe were the intention of that project, but I did it in my own way, and I did it in a way that I knew fueled my soul. So that happens often. I'm a create your own adventure kind of kid. So I'm often not checking the like literal linear boxes that I think some people are a little more used to.
Yeah. So do you remember that, like, if you even back up before that, like as a kid, do you remember challenging the status quo and like doing things that sparked you from a young age? Do you remember following that same process, or was it something that was crafted and developed as you realized that you had the confidence and the skill set to do those things?
Yeah, I think if I'm honest with you, I definitely probably was born this way. I like to think it was curated, but I think about Lego kits. I was like such a Lego kid, and you could get these amazing, cool sets. And I loved the instructions. Like I actually really, still to this day, really look forward to buying my IKEA set and putting my little bed tinker set together. But I know it's embarrassing. But at that age, like I really liked to go through and make my little Star Wars ship. I felt really satisfied. There was a satisfaction at completion. But what I really loved was dismantling that ship and being like, what else could there be? And I think it took a while. Like there got to a certain point when I remember I got some Lego set and I just almost couldn't be bothered to go through. I was like, what can I make that's not on the instruction sheet? So I think that is actually cultivated, I'm sure, from a pre-memory. Like my parents were really involved. My dad's an engineer. This is a big point of my passion, is I think had I not seen him and seen how excited he was about public works and like, hey, I get to design, I actually designed that. And this is a real thing that I saw on paper and here's how it came together. You could see that light in his eye. And so I think I had an appreciation for the built environment and for creating things. And my mom's quite artistic in her own right. And so I think probably there's some ambient noise that I hope to be able to provide back to kids and young adults in my own right of like, hey, this is what you can do with an imagination of helping build infrastructure, whether it's in Africa or here, is just being that, example of someone who really loves what they do and gets to kind of create their own adventure. It's certainly not as prescriptive as I think maybe the stereotype of an engineer might be seen as.
Yeah. Well, it's just the autonomy of that. So like when you're creating your own adventure, it's something exciting and unique to you. And it is something that you have that ownership and the autonomy to do it however you want. And there's a lot of fuel that goes with that, I think.
Totally. Yeah. I think I'm a fiercely independent character, and I imagine my mom probably had not easiest kid. But yeah, I think that there's something about all people have the capacity to find that inner fuel and that inner confidence and that inner interest. And it's just, sometimes those of us are lucky to have that really pulled out of us from our environment. And some people have to work a little bit more at getting access to it. And I think knowing that I had such deep privilege to have it come, like in my environment pulled it out, I feel really, really invigorated and inspired to help, maybe curate it in people where they didn't have that same exposure.
Sure. So, I mean, you talked about this, but I want to reiterate it a little bit. So, when you had your senior design project and you started a bridge in a country, so that was the birth of Bridges to Prosperity, right?
So I got involved. It was actually, I'm not the founder. This is another thing, is I actually like to be part of teams, right? So the idea of going off on my own isn't, in fact, like the first thing I think of. But I was living in Fiji, and a long story short was I'm volunteering with a healthcare organization because I was really looking for a sense of purpose. Wasn't really yet finding that engineering to people connection that I later found. So it's like, maybe I'll do some healthcare work. And we're walking out to these communities to be able to provide them with really basic preventative healthcare support. And we are getting to these rivers. And these rivers kept being this barrier to something so simple as talking with women about early breast cancer detection. And we came across a very simple pedestrian bridge, like a little trail bridge with cables. And it just like kind of hit me, like that makes it so we can get in to see these women. That same bridge, there's kids running and scampering past me to go back to or from school, I'm not sure. And there's, farmers holding their things above their head. And so it kind of imagined like, oh, this is not that complicated. We've been to engineering school. This is something you could kind of draw on a few pieces of paper and imagine how the load transfers. And it's not the easiest, but it's not the most challenging thing. And I found online, so who built this bridge? Unclear. Who builds these bridges in low-income communities around the world? And there's really only two groups. And one, long story short, I'm actually on the board of directors of now, but it's this very large, thousands and thousands of employees, nonprofit called Helvetas in Switzerland. And they're amazing. They're literally probably the most credible and impactful nonprofit international development organization in the world. Happen to do bridges as part of their bigger suite of things. And then there's this guy, Ken France, on an AOL website with his name and his photo and his personal cell phone number. And he's essentially like working with Rotarians, like Rotary clubs, to get a grant to go build the bridge. And at the time, he didn't have any full-time, there's no employees in the US, and it was just essentially he'd get a bridge, he'd have people on contract, some people longer for others. He had one woman there for a little while, like a year or two. But I kind of called him up and I was like, I'll build a bridge with you. And so I imagined I was helping this nonprofit. This was my give back. This was I'll do something nice and charitable before I go get my big girl job. And that first bridge in Peru with Bridges to Prosperity, it clicked. This is my team. These are my people. This is my purpose. And here's something that I think I could actually contribute to the world. I'll stick around for a little longer. And that's how I ended up writing my master's thesis at CU Boulder, was actually how to use standardized bridge designs so you can build them cost effectively in low income settings without testing. Mm-hmm. In short.
Yeah.
Answer. Sorry.
No, that's perfect. That totally tied it together. And I appreciate you doing that. So like what for a standard, I know as engineers, we're like nothing standard, like it's all custom, but what would be like an average budget for a bridge for one of the pedestrian bridges? Obviously it depends on size and all of these different things, but
I like to give people a kind of a sense of magnitude first on size, and then I'll get to money. Imagine about a football field. So you're in one end zone is one abutment, the other end zone is the other abutment. And that essentially means from the river somewhere in the middle. That might be a little longer than average, but not significantly so. So I'd say like an average bridge might be about 70 meters. So yards and meters are not terribly different. And in terms of cost, it really depends. So our business model is, we're not trying to save you. We're here to help support whatever is unavailable locally. So example in Rwanda is the Rwandan government actually puts 40% of the money into the projects that are needed because it's so important to them. So we bring in the philanthropy that helps support the things that might not be available locally, or frankly, just more expensive than would be in their local market. You know, we'll bring in steel pipe, we'll bring in cables that are repurposed and recycled, but also not available otherwise. We'll pay for engineers to train local engineers, these things. So all in, our costs range from about $60,000 US to maybe 80 to 90. But what's really impressive, I think, is, you know, you're an engineer. It's like most projects, that would be a contingency line on one part of a budget. You know, if you were to be building, like people are like,
design fee.
Wait, what? No, you can't possibly design, build, and, you know, get the whole asset up and running for that amount of money. That can't be possible. And it is. It is. It's, you know, it's a very cost-effective way to connect people, much cheaper than putting roads, especially if you think about 1 billion people around the world. It's like 1 in 7 walk everywhere. You know, they're not on bicycles, they're not on motorcycles, they're certainly not getting on cars or taxis. So they're walking everywhere and they're isolated. So there's many billion that walk everywhere, but 1 billion people literally don't have physical access. So if you think about, they don't need a $2 million road bridge. Right. They need an $80,000 trail bridge. And maybe someday when the economy booms, then let's build out the vehicular infrastructure. But I think that's why I'm really excited, is that this is a low cost, high impact intervention. It's kind of like the jargon that graduates entire communities out of poverty. It's not just one house for one family. It's a bridge that increases household level income by 30% across thousands of people. And like, you know, I, as a fellow Iowan, I like to kind of joke when I do public speaking. I'm like, if I could walk down, you know, the farm roads where my granddad, you know, really spent how many generations back growing this land and tilling this land, if I could walk up to every farmer and say, I can increase your profitability 75%, and I can make it so you guys take home 30% more, like just like you make $100 a week, now you make 130. I would be the most popular kid on the street. And I think I'm actually maybe an ex-presidential candidate. But, you know, the reality is that like in Nicaragua, where these studies first were happening, and now we're doing studies in Rwanda, it's such the low-hanging fruit. This infrastructure allows people to go from the uncertainty of like, can I even go to school today? Can my kid come home tonight? Can I go to a market on the day that it's going to be everyone there? Or maybe I need to risk it and just sell it to whoever walks by. So the ability to just like, no, like I for sure can go there, produces a tremendous amount of dignity for people. Like I don't have to risk like being super conservative and hoarding my food just in case it rains and I'm isolated. You can actually start to participate in the economy, and you're doing it for the people that have the least, because they're the most isolated. They have the least healthy families, the poorest families, and also the least educated families. And you're helping to take people born on the wrong side of the tracks and giving them the opportunity to be right there with everyone else. And so that's like just such a cool, awesome thing to do when you wake up every day. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So can you explain the feeling, which I know it's hard to explain a feeling probably, because it's probably a very complex feeling, but when that bridge is finished and when people are able to access it and walk across it, because you're there, right? Or your team's there, right? When that day occurs, right?
Yeah.
What does that feel like?
It's just like this such deep sense of, it's like both a mix of humility, like, wow, I can't believe I get to be part of this. It's like humbling. That's the word. So humbling. But it's also like some pride, you know, like I don't want to call it ego, but it's like, wow, we collectively did this. And I think, you know, when we'll probably get to this in a little bit, but when I was in that IMAX film and the Dream Big film crew comes down with me to Haiti, they were really interested ahead of time. Imagine like an American film crew, really smart, really prepared. They want to know like, what are the shots? What are the things we need to be prepared for? And I was like, well, let me tell you. And I was like, I can't tell you what the stories are going to be. I can't tell you who's going to tell you what. Like, I just can't even predict it. But trust me, we've now built 330 of these bridges. Like, there's some themes. And one of the themes is just have your cameras ready that first day when those kids go across that bridge and it clicks. Because you kind of have to imagine, like, if you can see pictures, like even if we have pictures of other bridges, and even if we have all these diagrams, they've been spending months as a community digging holes, carrying rocks, building up these like, what the heck is this? Because many people have never seen a cable supported structure in these rural remote environments. Like they're kind of complex.
Mm-hmm.
And so it doesn't click for even people like the laborers working on these projects. It's often like, we trust you, we know it's going to happen. And then those cables go across in the matter of 2 to 3 days. You then have essentially a bunch of what we can call them hangers, stringers, that are cross beams. And then you put the actual deck across it. And this IMAX film crew, they kept asking, like, what is the shots on, on inauguration day? I was like, oh, don't you worry. These kids running across this bridge and the hope and joy that they show on their faces and the realization that this is their new reality will tell your whole story for you. And I think that is like the felt experience that I think that you can get when either you're watching it on Netflix or whether you had the chance to watch it in the IMAX film screen. It's like, wow, that's amazing. It's kind of like we as a community of engineers here in the United States, helping engineers and laborers and masons around the world, are making possible connection that I don't want to say it's unimaginable, but it takes some creative imagining for a lot of rural community members to see access as a permanent solution.
Yeah, well, and it's like so many of us as engineers, we want to be helpers. We want to change the world. We want to be able to help people. And that is just, that's like a life mission. And that's, at the very core of it. And I got to say, during that movie, cue the One Day song and those shots, and I was a mess.
My wife watched it. We had to go on this film tour of like when it came out at the Smithsonian, and like you're going city to city pre-COVID, obviously. And she came to me with a couple of them. And I don't think I'm throwing under the bus to say this, but she would just weep through that whole sequence every time. I think she saw it like 10 times. And then it came out on Netflix. And I tell you what, I find her like with my mother-in-law off in the den, going through and watching Dream Big sequences, she's like weeping again. You don't have to be an engineer to really appreciate the impact of, a changed reality for people. And it keeps getting you over and over.
So do you feel like that, like those feelings, and like when that happens, when you see how it impacts, does that fuel you for the next one then?
I think what fueled me in the beginning is certainly different than what fuels me now. Like being in this now 14, 15 years, I think in the beginning, I wanted to be the person putting that last deck board in the middle to make that connection from one side to the other. And then it kind of changed, and it was like, is this about me or is this about the community and the people we're trying to train to do this? And so it kind of changed a little bit. So now I still wanted to be there. Let's be clear. I really wanted to be there, but I wanted to have a little bit of like, oh, but look, they did it. And I got to witness. And I think, my understanding of the power structure in any kind of impact work, I really had to start thinking pretty seriously about, who is in this and why and for what end goal. And I'd say today, I get the most satisfaction about the fact that right now, even in a time of COVID, I have a team of Rwandans and East Africans more generally in Rwanda building bridges, and there is not an expatriate there, and they don't need us. Like, that's not why I am part of this organization now. I get a lot of satisfaction by telling the story or finding a family who's like, I want to have our family legacy be this bridge, and helping them, be able to support this bridge in another part of the world that they otherwise might not ever see or be connected to, and being able to make those kind of more figurative bridging connections now and say, hey, I brought the resource for that. That's what I do, is I help to tell the story for people who have power and privilege. And we've all been deeply blessed by the fact that we are born in this country. We have already a huge leg up from so many people in the world. And to be able to make that, figurative bridge into a literal one is really where I get my fuel today. So call me back in 5 years, 10 years, it will change. But I think you kind of have to reinvent yourself, and you have to, I think it's incumbent upon each of us to really look deeply at, our assumptions, and to think about like, how are we complicit into some of the power dynamics that we inherit? And also, if there is complicity, how can we change it? So that's active work for me daily.
Yeah. I think you brought up a couple of really interesting things there. So one, you were kind of talking about how like self-sufficiency. So once it's built, they're trained so that they can do maintenance, right? So like you said, in COVID, like right now, it's difficult for people to travel, but local people in their communities can service these bridges, right? So that they are still functioning. And so you're teaching them life skills too, and self-sufficiency, which is a super amazing concept. Um, and then the other thing that you're talking about, people, leaving a legacy. So as far as funding, like, most of your funding, does that come from private sources or from grants, or is it a mixture of both?
Yeah, it's actually, we kind of talk about it as maybe like four-legged stool. Hopefully not ever anyone totally knocks off, but pardon me. We have what we consider a big individual giving program. And so that's a huge part of how we just know that we're going to be okay, even in times like right now. And it's just $10 a month, $10 a year, someone being able to afford $100 a month, and just saying that we commit to and want to continue doing this important work. And we're with you on the journey. We kind of, consider it like a long-term partnership, and they get to see the stories of impact and be part of it. And that individual giving, can be a school room in Iowa, that can be a family, that could be even a big family foundation that says, hey, this is going to be something we're doing on the long run. We also have individual donors who it's a lot, maybe they're not deep in their philanthropy yet, and they say, we're going to make a one-time gift. And sometimes those gifts are quite significant. They could be like paying for a whole bridge. And that is not insignificant for us, is to be able to find individuals who say, we're philanthropic. We want to leave a legacy. We want to really, make a big impact on the world. We're attracted to the fact that you build a bridge, it's there 30 years. We're attracted that that bridge creates enough income in that community to pay for itself in the first 2 years. So it's like really a multiplier, for especially very, very strategic philanthropists. We have a lot of individuals, and I'll get to this in a bit, foundations, who say, we just care most about how to create economic prosperity. We don't care how you do it. Oh, and by the way, bridges are the most cost-effective way to create economic prosperity for the poor.
Okay.
The third bucket is companies. We've really I'd say we've grown up with architects, engineers, and contractors. That's how we've learned our craft. Like, we've actually worked with the world's most innovative and well-known bridge engineers. And we've worked with people who've actually built, bridges and power lines and things here in the United States, who've transferred their skills, helped us build our processes, our standard, techniques and designs, and so forth. And meanwhile, their company supports projects in this kind of mutually beneficial exchange. So, individual small donors, individual big donors, companies, and then our fourth bucket is foundations. So we've been really fortunate that there's a bit of a trend in the nonprofit world where it doesn't matter if you're Habitat for Humanity or the Humane Shelter or Bridges to Prosperity, we're really held to a higher standard of accountability and metrics. So you can't just tell a good marketing story and be like, but trust me. For the big sophisticated foundations, people who give away money professionally, you really have to be able to understand what comes from what you do. So you build a bridge, no one cares. People cross that bridge, interesting, where are they crossing to? Oh, they're crossing, they're actually having higher incomes. They're going, they have access to markets, access to healthcare, access to schools. So to be able to have the data collection processes and also the sophistication to track that and be able to capture what we call attribution. So what happens with a bridge compared to without, and being able to go to a donor who may never have thought a bridge is a cost-effective way to change the world and say, hey, you could put your money in these 10 things, but Bridges to Prosperity actually creates the most wealth, most cost efficiently. So those four buckets have really sustained us. And, COVID's tough because I think all four get cut when people are difficult with the economic times, but we're really optimistic, people will continue to find ways to give.
Yeah. So how's that affected the actual bridge building then? Like, are projects on hold, or are you like, what's happening there?
Yeah, so just like here, pretty much every country had to designate for themselves what is considered critical okay. Services, critical employees. And in both Uganda and Rwanda, bridge building was deemed an essential service. So we had a really I'm sure like so many leaders across the world had to have some soul searching, like, wow, they want us to go back to work. And, you know, here I am in Colorado, I'm certainly not going out in public. And so we really had to like first say, what's the right move? And then the right move for us was to continue building, because communities being able to be connected to have that healthcare provision, should it be necessary, is time critical. But
Yeah.
how are we going to do that safely so we don't put people in harm's way? And that was a big learning, very quick, you know, it's a sprinting marathon, as we like to say. It's like go fast for a long time to figure that out. But like, how do you thermally scan anyone that enters our construction site? How do you make sure everyone has their own personal protective equipment that rotates on a few-hour basis? How do you make sure everyone's trained how to keep physical distancing? How do you make sure people understand the importance of hand washing and frequency? And these things that aren't in their own right terribly complex, but here we are trying to dig trenches to build anchors and pour anchors. And normally you could have 6 people in that, you know, in that benched excavation, and today you can do 2. And normally you're able to just have this chain of people handing a rock to the next, to the next, to the next, and they're touching each other. You know, you can't do that. And so the reality is that we feel a commitment to our partners in our countries. The government has said we would like to keep moving. We feel obliged to meet them there, but we are definitely slower, and it's definitely more expensive in order to meet that same, let's call it like demand and expectation that it was 6 months ago. So it's hard, but you know, slow, but what did they say? Slow but sure.
Yeah.
Some saying, I don't know.
I catch you. I know what you're saying. Yeah, because it's not like there's probably restroom facilities right there to wash your hands with a bunch of soap and let the water run for 20 seconds or whatever. Happy birthday song, whatever it's supposed to be. Like your resources are so different and so limited compared to what we have here. So that I didn't even think of that challenge that you have to deal with too. So
And think about the supply chain around soap, or, you know, like, not that you could actually find hand sanitizer in East Africa right now, but if you could, how do you get it to the rural context? Because aforementioned, we're working in places that you're not driving to.
yeah,
So
pack it
we
in.
call it we call it the last mile. You can think of
Okay.
it in 2 ways. Like, that's kind of the context where we live and work, is the last mile. So how do you, that's kind of using Coca-Cola as the figurative example. The very last mile that Coca-Cola needs to get to reach the last billion people, they're crossing our bridges. But you could also switch that and call it the first mile. The first mile, where a billion people start in order to get to school, in order to get to a market. And so whether you think of it as last mile or first mile, you know, that's a big challenge of, like, in the time of COVID, we can't get PPE, couldn't get PPE for our own healthcare professionals here in the United States for a number of weeks, if not months. How are you going to get it to the countries that are landlocked and everything is shut down, and let alone 10% of the population already is isolated? It's
Yeah.
it's a quagmire.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I commend you all for keeping business as much usual as you can. Like, that just seems like such an undertaking. So, way to go.
Like everyone else, new normal, right?
So I would ask you what you're passionate about, but I think you found a way to mix work and passion. But is there anything unexpected, or like a hobby or something that maybe, like, what do you do in your free time?
Um, this is going to sound a little weird. I flip houses.
Okay.
So that is actually unexpected, but I find it really creative. So I started doing it when I was really young. It was a way, because I was being paid like $500 a month from Bridges to Prosperity, because I'm essentially a volunteer, you know, like anything charitable. You're never going to, anyone listening out there that has aspirations to be a nonprofit worker, do it because you love it, not because you're going to make a lot of money. And so I got started just like buying a tiny little home and fixing it up as I went. I was living there. And what do I do in my free time? It's, I know how to do everything from frame a wall to drywall it to tile it to, you know, I'm looking around the house right now. I know how to do electrical switches and outlets now. That's a fairly recent thing. I sure can paint pretty well, but, you know, I think it's a kind of a work. It's a bit of a, I don't mean this in any sort of derogatory word, but like, I have a much more blue collar upbringing, and I really enjoy the tactile doing. That's, I think, why I went to art school, is I like the feel of doing something. And as
Yeah.
my role, especially at Bridges to Prosperity, went from I'm there carrying the rock, doing the thing, into more enabling,
Mm-hmm.
the lack of the tactile feel, the touch, the like I did this today thing made me even more excited about how can you like design a new kitchen in a way that is more, you know, natural to flow through, in a way that other people and myself would enjoy living in more. So I do that a lot.
Okay.
Yeah. There's other things, but
Yeah.
I'm kind of a busy bee, so I'm always in motion.
So with doing the house flipping, do you feel like that ties in your creative outlet then? Like, is that what you use to funnel the creative outlet?
Well, you didn't ask, but you know, I'm an active journaler, as I think a
Okay.
lot of people probably are. I have journals back to like 16, but I started doing entire sections. This is kind
I
of funny.
saw.
The entire sections of,
Oh,
you know, like I want to design houses and rooms and how would I put them together, and here are floor plans and
oh
here's how
my
the
gosh.
stairs, and like, you know, you kind of start to get your arms around it. And if you really love it, like I do, then I become compulsive, and then I do 3D isometric drawings of what I think it's going to look like when I'm in the kitchen. So you get an idea. It's a little bit like you know, I think design, I could draw bridges till I was blue in the face, and I do still. But there's a little bit of creativity of space and movement and imagining what's not there yet. And that's why I think STEM fields more generally is that, you know, engineers were taught not only to look at a problem, like, ooh, that house is terrible, but be like, ooh, what's the solution? And that's the creative Lego part of the whole thing, is like you get a set of things, and once you kind of figure out the patterns and you get to figure out the kind of infinite number of solutions, there's no one right answer, as you're well aware, in engineering. And that's so liberating, you know, like there's not one right kitchen design. I
Yeah.
could draw that till, you know, the cows come home, and it's still not perfect or correct. You know, it's just like, what do I like the most? So
And there's
yeah,
always just something just waiting to be discovered, right? Like
yeah,
something like an idea like, oh, like this would look really cool right here. And that's gratifying to get
I love
that
it.
thought too, right?
Yeah. And
Okay.
yeah. Anyway.
Okay. So who would be like if you were to pick one person that inspires you, who would be one person that inspires you?
So you did a good job of prepping me on the basic framing of what we're going to talk about. And this is the one that I like, you know, slept with, woke up with, went back to bed with. And I think, like, you know, there's a lot of maybe more popular figurative people in the world that I prepared to sound smart and clever and well educated. But when I really came to my core, you know, I think my mom is the person who really has like been most informative in my, like, you know, sense of self-belief and curiosity, and like the unconditional support that she provided for me throughout what um, I'm sure was not an easy parenting journey. I was a late bloomer as it comes to things of respect, and you know, I think I was a little ornery, put lightly. And I think, like, just to reflect now in hindsight how she handled a lot of energy and a lot of personality and a lot of opinion in a very small body, and still didn't, you know, put me into any sort of space that felt closing. My doors were always open. My world was bigger. And I think it's now in my, like, you know, later, like imagining being a parent myself, I'm like, wow, like, I don't know if I have the capacity to be that open and that generous of spirit. And so it might not be as well known of a character as some of the people I was prepared to talk about, but I think my mom has been just such a, you know, inspiration and in person. I really hope to be even, you know, slightly as good of a mother as she is. So
I love that. And it sounds like she had the end game in mind.
yeah, she's like, get her out of the house, get her out.
No, no, knowing that you like eventually all of that tenacity is going to pay off and do very good things, or you'll help you to do very good, amazing things. But I love the word that you said, curiosity, though, too. I think that like fostering that curiosity is so important, and that is a skill for sure. So
I can imagine all the whys, you know, you're on kids, like, it's like, why that? Why that? Like, I just, like, my first gut hit's like, no more whys, just because, you know, like, that's like, I can go there pretty quick. And the space that was created for me to be curious and to pull things apart and to put them back together and just the chaos. I cannot even imagine the Lego chaos. So I owe both my parents, to be very clear. They both are really generous. But you know,
That's awesome. So I have just a funny little story about Legos. So I have two kids and they play, well, not so much anymore, but they used to play with Legos all the time. And we were under a tornado warning at one point, and my housekeeping skills were less than stellar. So the whole basement was Legos everywhere. And I was like, I don't know where we're gonna go. We're supposed to go to the basement, but I feel like we have like shrapnel in our basement. And if there's an actual tornado, we are not in a good situation. So
those things are sharp. People
yes.
don't think about those little tiny streamline edges. Or I don't want to be sliced by Legos either.
No, I don't think it would be good. So anyway, I don't want to take up any more of your time, Avery. I really appreciate you sitting down, and this has been invigorating, inspiring, and amazing. You're doing great work. Keep it up. Keep inspiring youth. I know you do a lot of that, and connecting people. So thanks so much for joining us.
It's totally my pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.